only legal education was under the tutelage of George Wythe, who was the very first law professor in the nation here at the College of William and Mary. And Marshall studied under Wythe for several months in 1780. I think Marshall was in between shifts, as they say, with the American Revolution and his assignment. And I believe it was sort of a win-win for him to study under Wythe, because he had met a lovely lady in Yorktown, which is not very far away. This way he could spend the summer studying under the famous George Wythe and also getting to know Polly Ambler a little better. So I believe he was multitasking that summer. Part of George Wythe's educational philosophy was standard, where you would summarize legal treatises in cases. That was not an innovation. But there were several educational innovations that George Wythe added to the table. One is something we do in law school today. It's called a moot court, which is sort of practicing. The students play the roles of lawyers, and Wythe, as the professor, would play the role of the judge. And they would press arguments to him, and he would ask questions, and they would get to therefore practice their oral advocacy skills in addition to learning the ins and outs of the case. And in addition to a moot court, Wythe also did something called a moot legislature, where the students would debate issues that would be in front of the Virginia legislature, the Virginia Assembly, or Congress. And this was sort of a masterful educational innovation, because not only are they practicing how to speak on their feet, but they're also learning the ins and outs of the pressing issues of the day. It was a way to assure that he was educating statesmen in addition to just lawyers. I think the reason that Wythe was so loved by his students was probably because he invested in the whole student. They would stay at his house. They would go for drinks and dinner at a tavern. They would read the humanities in addition to legal texts. I mean, he saw himself as part of their family in a way that maybe is unique in education at that time. And that's what made him so well loved. The list of alumni from George Wythe's classes is very impressive. He not only taught Thomas Jefferson and Bishop Madison, so a cousin of James Madison, but in addition, Henry Clay and Edmund Randolph. A lot of course, John Marshall, a lot of the who's who of early American statesmen all had their legal education from George Wythe. George Wythe was the first American law professor. In 1779, he held a chair in what was called law and police. But by police, they meant something more like political science or government. And he was the second in the English-speaking world, second behind Oxford. So it was a Thomas Jefferson idea to have Wythe teach young lawyers. Jefferson had studied under Wythe before Wythe held his chair at William and Mary. But the idea behind it was to create citizen lawyers, to create people who would lead our nation into greatness, and to create lawyers to do that. John Marshall was in that early class of statesmen, the first alumni of George Wythe, the first of young lawyers to lead a nation. Marbury was a man who was going to become a justice of the peace, but his commission wasn't delivered in time. So he was a man out of luck. And when the administration changed and he didn't get the job, he didn't get the post, he sued to have his commission delivered because he wanted his job. So Marbury was one of several midnight judges, so several judges who were appointed at the end of one administration before the beginning of the other. And most of them had their commissions delivered sort of in an overnight rush by none other than Marshall himself. But Marbury was not one of the lucky ones. He didn't get his commission, and he brought the lawsuit because he wanted it. Marshall issued a very clever opinion because he didn't have to order Jefferson to do something that Jefferson might have balked at. Instead, he was able to say, well, Marbury is owed this commission, and no man is above the law. He deserves this commission. Well, Thomas Jefferson thought that those midnight judges were that was some political shenanigans, to use a legal term of art. And I don't think not only did he not think Marbury deserved his commissions, he thought the whole prospect of the midnight commissions was illegitimate. John Marshall, this is what makes the opinion, I think, so brilliant. He knew that he couldn't really force Jefferson to do something that he didn't want to do. But he instead says, look, Marbury is owed his commission. No man is above the law, not even a cabinet department member like Madison. However, the statute that purports to give Marbury jurisdiction in our court is actually unconstitutional because it enlarges our power, our jurisdiction, beyond what it can. So he does several things at once. He declares the power of judicial review, the power of courts to tell us that statutes and executive action are unconstitutional and therefore void. But he does it in a case where it's the courts that he's actually restricting. So he's not facing sort of a balk by the executive. He's not facing Jefferson saying, "Oh, okay, thanks for that idea, but no," and he's able to declare the power in a way that insulates the power, and that's what makes it so beautiful. I mean, Marbury loses, so it's not beautiful for Marbury, but the legacy of the case endures, which is the power of judicial review. I don't think Marshall invented it. I think he cemented it. He cemented the power of judicial review. It's pretty well understood that the framers thought there'd be some sort of power of judicial review. But Marshall gave it the sort of the exclamation point that it needed by saying it is emphatically the duty and the power of the judicial department to say what the law is. I think the transition, the election of 1800 and the transition from the Adams administration to the Jefferson administration, I wouldn't call it a love fest, that's for sure. It was definitely political shenanigans. There was not a lot of love lost, and you can see that in the facts of Marbury versus Madison. You can see that just in the image of Marshall delivering these commissions at midnight, before Jefferson could be inaugurated. And can you imagine if that happened today? I think of John Marshall as the father of judicial review, as the most important Chief Justice in a line of very important Chief Justices ever to serve the United States Supreme Court. When Oliver Ellsworth resigned as Chief Justice, Adams originally asked John Jay to come back and fill the post. And Jay said no. He said, "That's not an important office. It's not an important branch of government. It's not worth my time." That's a paraphrase. So I think you can honestly say that John Marshall took lemons and made lemonade. He was able to make that branch of government what it is today. And that, I think, is his most important legacy. There's something about Marshall's emphatic tone and the way he declared the role of the judiciary. And we'll never forget it's a constitution we're expounding. Like that language has mattered over time as we have the debate about the role of courts in our constitutional discourse. And I do think I think the language that he used matters. I use the phrase money quote. I think it's a money quote for a reason, and it came from that man at that time. And I'm not sure if someone had said it in a less emphatic way, it wouldn't be as powerful. I always like to teach my students that line from McCulloch where Marshall says, "Let's never forget it's a constitution we're expounding." And that line is so important to thinking about the role of the Constitution in today's politics. It's not a tax code. It's not something where we expect the rules to be precise and already thought out. It's indeterminate text that is meant to last for generations. And when I talk to them about that view of the Constitution, the living Constitution, some of them are surprised to know that the origin of that idea traces back to John Marshall and McCulloch versus Maryland. I think he might be surprised at the scope of judicial review today. Marbury versus Madison was a very big deal, but it was ultimately a decision about the limitations on the judiciary, that it was a statute about the scope of the Supreme Court's jurisdiction that Marshall found to be unconstitutional. He might be surprised to think that the power of judicial review now extends well beyond just the judiciary marking its own territory and onto any other act of the executive or Congress. I think that there's something very unique when you ask a judge to listen to both sides of the argument and think about it very deeply and then defend his or her position with written arguments and logic. That's a different kind of decision-making than we ask out of legislatures or we ask out of the president. And it's a valuable form of decision-making. Does it mean all of our controversial issues should be decided that way? No. But there is value to our democracy by actually having some distance from democracy itself, by giving some choices outside of the mob, outside of the majority, to the hands of judges.